Part 1. Chapter 8 of Mizora, A Prophecy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.A. Wells, Phoenix, Arizona. Mizora, A Prophecy by Mary E. Bradley Lane. Chapter 8. It was during my visit at my friend's house that I first witnessed the peculiar manner in which the markets in Mizora are conducted. Everything, as usual, was fastidiously neat and clean. The fruit and vegetables were fresh and perfect. I examined quantities of them to satisfy myself, and not a blemish or imperfection could be found on any. None but buyers were attending market. Baskets of fruit, bunches of vegetables, and, in fact, everything exhibited for sale had the quality and price labeled upon it. Small wicker baskets were near to receive the change. When a buyer had selected what suited her, she dropped the label and the change in the basket. I saw one basket filled with gold and silver coin. Yet not one would be missing when the owner came to count up the sales. Sometimes a purchaser was obliged to change a large piece of money, but it was always done accurately. There was one singular trait these people possessed that, in conjunction with their other characteristics, may seem unnatural. They would give and exact the last centime, a quarter of a cent, in a trade. I noticed this peculiarity so frequently that I inquired the reason for it, and when I had studied it over, I decided that, like all the other rules that these admirable people had established, it was wise. Said my friend, "We set a value on everything we prepare for sale. Anything above or below that would be unjust to buyer or seller." The varieties of apples, pears, and peaches and other fruits had their names attached, with the quality sweet, sour, or slightly acid. In no instance was it found to be incorrectly stated. I came to one stall that contained nothing but glass jars of butter and cream. The butter was a rich buff color, like very fine qualities I had seen in my own country. The cream, an article I am fond of drinking, looked so tempting I longed to purchase a glass for that purpose. The lady whom I accompanied, my hostess's cook, informed me that it was artificially prepared. The butter and cheese were chemical productions. Different laboratories produced articles of varying flavor, according to the chemist's skill. Although their construction was no secret, yet some laboratories enjoyed special reputation for their butter and cheese owing to the accuracy with which their elements were combined. She gave me quite a history about artificial food, also how they kept fruits and vegetables in their natural state for years without decaying or losing their flavor, so that when eaten they were nearly as fine as when freshly gathered. After hearing that the cream was manufactured, I resolved to taste it. Dropping my coin into the basket, I took up a glass and drank it. A look of disgust crossed the countenance of my companion. "Do you not drink this?" I asked in surprise as I set down the empty vessel. "It is truly delicious." "At regular meal times we all use it, and sometimes drink it in preference to other beverages, but never in public. You will never see a citizen of Mizora eating in public. Look all over this market, and you will not discover one person, either adult or child, eating or drinking, unless it be water." I could not, and I felt keenly mortified at my mistake. Yet in my own country and others that, according to our standard, are highly civilized, a beverage is made from the juice of the corn that is not only drank in public places, but its effects, which are usually unbecoming, are exhibited also, and frequently without reproof. However, I said nothing to my companion about this beverage. It bears no comparison in color or taste to that made in Mizora. I could not have distinguished the latter from the finest dairy cream. The next place of interest that I visited were their mercantile bazaars or stores. Here I found things looking quite familiar. The goods were piled upon shelves behind counters, and numerous clerks were in attendance. It was the regular day for shopping among the Mizora ladies, and the merchants had made a display of their prettiest and richest goods. I noticed the ladies were as elegantly dressed as if for a reception, and learned that it was the custom. They would meet a great many friends and acquaintances and dress to honor the occasion. It was my first shopping experience in Mizora, and I quite mortified myself by removing my glove and rubbing and examining closely the goods I thought of purchasing. I entirely ignored the sweet voice of the clerk that was gently informing me that it was pure linen or pure wool. So habituated had I become in my own country to being my own judge of the quality of the goods I was purchasing, regardless always of the seller's recommendation of it. I found it difficult, especially in such circumstances, to always remember their strict adherence to honesty and fair dealing. I felt rebuked when I looked around and saw the actions of the other ladies in buying. In manufactured goods, as in all other things, not the slightest cheatery is to be found. Woolen and cotton mixtures were never sold for pure wool. Nobody seemed to have heard of the art of glossing muslin cuffs and collars and selling them for pure linen. Fearing that I had wounded the feelings of the lady in attendance upon me, I hastened to apologize by explaining the peculiar method of trade that were practiced in my own country. They were immediately pronounced barbarous. I noticed that ladies in shopping examined colors and effects of trimmings or combinations, but never examined the quality. Whatever the attendant said about that was received as fact. The reason for the absence of attendants in the markets and the presence of them in mercantile houses was apparent at once. The market articles were bought fresh every day, while goods were stored. Their business houses and their manner of shopping were unlike anything I had ever met with before. The houses were all built in a hollow square, enclosing a garden with a fountain in the center. They were inevitably roofed over with glass, as was the entire building. In winter, the garden was as warm as the interior of the store. It was adorned with flowers and shrubs. I often saw ladies and children promenading in these pretty enclosures, or sitting on their rustic sofas, conversing, while their friends were shopping in the store. The arrangement gave perfect light and comfort to both clerks and customers, and the display of rich and handsome fabrics was enhanced by the bit of scenery beyond. In summer, the water for the fountain was artificially cooled. Every clerk was provided with a chair suspended by pulleys from strong iron rods fastened above. They could be raised or lowered at will, and when not occupied, could be drawn up out of the way. After the goods were purchased, they were placed in a machine that wrapped and tied them, ready for delivery. A dining room was always a part of every store. I desired to be shown this, and found it was as tasteful and elegant in its appointments as a private one would be. Silver and china and fine damask made it inviting to the eye, and I had no doubt the cooking corresponded as well with the taste. The streets of Mizora were all paved. Even the roads through the villages were furnished an artificial cover, durable, smooth, and elastic. For this purpose, a variety of materials were used. Some had artificial stone, in the manufacture of which Mizora could surpass nature's production. Artificial wood they also made, and used for pavements, as well as cement made of fine sand. The latter was the least durable, but possessed considerable elasticity and made a very fine driving park. They were experimenting when I came away on sanded glass for roadbeds. The discovery was to overcome its susceptibility to attrition. After business hours, every street was swept by a machine. The streets and sidewalks in dry weather were as free from soil as the floor of a private house would be. Animals and domestic fowls had long been extinct in Mizora. This was one cause of the weird silence that so impressed me on my first view of their capital city. Invention had superseded the usefulness of animals in all departments. In the field and the chemistry of food, artificial power was utilized for all vehicles. The vehicle most popular with the Mizora ladies for shopping and culling purposes was a low carriage, sometimes with 2 seats, sometimes with 1. They were upholstered with the richest fabrics, were exceedingly light and graceful in shape, and not above 3 feet from the ground. They were strong and durable, though frequently not exceeding 50 pounds in weight. The wheel was the curious and ingenious part of the structure, for in its peculiar construction lay the delight of its motion. The spokes were flat bands of steel, curved outward to the tire. The carriage had no springs other than these spokes, yet it moved like a boat gliding downstream with the current. I was fortunate enough to preserve a drawing of this wheel, which I hope some day to introduce in my own land. The carriages were propelled by compressed air or electricity, and sometimes with a mechanism that was simply pressed with the foot. I liked the compressed air. It was most easily managed by me. The Mizora ladies preferred electricity, of which I was always afraid. They were experimenting with a new propelling power during my stay that was to be acted upon by light, but it had not come into general use, although I saw some vehicles that were propelled by it. They moved with incredible speed, so rapid indeed that the upper part of the carriage had to be constructed of glass and securely closed while in motion to protect the occupant. It was destined, I heard some of their scientists say, to become universal, as it was the most economical power yet discovered. They patiently tried to explain it to me, but my faculties were not receptive to such advanced philosophy, and I had to abandon the hope of ever introducing it into my own country. There was another article manufactured in Mizora that excited my wonder and admiration. It was elastic glass. I have frequently mentioned the unique uses that they made of it, and I must now explain why. They had discovered a process to render it as pliable as rubber. It was more useful than rubber could be, for it was almost indestructible. It had superseded iron in many ways. All cooking utensils were made of it. It entered largely into the construction and decoration of houses. All cisterns and cellars had an inner lining of it. All underground pipes were made of it, and many things that are necessities and luxuries of life. They spun it into threads as fine and delicate as a spider's gossamer, and wove it into a network of clear or variegated colors that dazzled the eye to behold. Innumerable were the lovely fabrics made of it, the frailest lace, in the most intricate and aerial patterns, that had the advantage of never soiling, never tearing, and never wearing out. Curtains for drawing-room arches were frequently made of it. Some of them looked like woven dewdrops. One set of curtains that I greatly admired and was a long time ignorant of what they were made of were so unique I must do myself the pleasure to describe them. They hung across the arch that led to the glass conservatory attached to my friend's handsome dwelling. 3 very thin sheets of glass were woven separately and then joined at the edges so ingeniously as to defy detection. The inside curtain was one solid color, crimson. Over this was a curtain of snowflakes, delicate as those aerial nothings of the sky, and more durable than any fabric known. Hung across the arched entrance to a conservatory, with a great globe of white fire shining through it, it was as lovely as the blush of Aphrodite when she rose from the sea, veiled in its fleecy foam. They also possessed the art of making glass highly refractive. Their tableware surpassed in beauty all that I had ever previously seen. I saw teacups as frail-looking as soap bubbles, possessing the delicate iridescence of opals. Many other exquisite designs were the product of its flexibility and transparency. The first article that attracted my attention was the dress of an actress on the stage. It was lace, made of gossamer threads of amber in the design of lilies and leaves, and was worn over black velvet. The wonderful water scene that I beheld at the theater was produced by waves made of glass and edged with foam. A milky glass spun into tiny bubbles. They were agitated by machinery and caused them to roll with a terribly natural look. The blinding flashes of light had been the display of genuine electricity. Nothing in the way of artistic effect could call forth admiration or favorable comment unless it was so exact an imitation of nature as to not be distinguished from the real without the closest scrutiny. In private life, no one assumed a part. All the acting I ever saw in Mizora was done upon the stage. I could not appreciate their mental pleasures any more than a savage could delight in the nocturne of Chopin. Yet one was the intellectual ecstasy of a sublime intelligence, and the other the harmonious rapture of a divinely melodious soul. I must here mention that the processes of chemical experiment in Mizora differed materially from those I had known. I had once seen and tasted a preparation called artificial cream that had been prepared by a friend of my father's, an eminent English chemist. It was simply a combination of the known properties of cream united in the presence of gentle heat. But in Mizora, they took certain chemicals and converted them into milk and cream and cheese and butter, every variety of meat in a vessel that admitted neither air nor light. They claimed that the elements of air and light exercised a material influence upon the chemical production of foods, that they could not be made successfully by artificial processes when exposed to those two agents. Their earliest efforts had been unsuccessful of exact imitation, and a perfect result had only been obtained by closely counterfeiting the processes of nature. The cream prepared artificially that I had tasted in London was the same color and consistency as natural cream, but it lacked its relish. The cream manufactured in Mizora was a perfect imitation of the finest dairy product. It was the same with meats. They combined the elements, and the article produced possessed no detrimental flavor. It was a more economical way of obtaining meat than by fattening animals. They were equally fortunate in the manufacture of clothing. Every mountain was a cultivated forest, for which they obtained every variety of fabric, silks, satins, velvets, laces, woolen goods, and the richest articles of beauty and luxury, in which no way to array themselves were upon the market at a trifling cost, compared to what they were manufactured at in my own country. Pallid and haggard women and children working incessantly for a pittance that barely sustained existence was the ultimatum that the search after the cause of cheap prices arrived at in my world. But here it traveled from one bevy of beautiful workwomen to another, until it ended at the laboratory where science was throned, the grand, majestic, humane queen, this thrice happy land. End of Chapter 8. Recording by J.A. Wells, Phoenix, Arizona. Part 1, Chapter 9 of Mizora, a Prophecy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.A. Wells, Phoenix, Arizona. Mizora, a Prophecy by Mary E. Bradley Lane. Chapter 9. Whenever I inquired, "From whence comes the heat that is so evenly distributed throughout the dwellings and public buildings of Mizora?" they invariably pointed to the river. I asked in astonishment, "From water comes fire?" And they answered, "Yes." I had long before this time discovered that Mizora was a nation of very wonderful people, individually and collectively, and as every revelation of their genius occurred, I would feel as though I could not be surprised at any marvelous thing that they should claim to do. But I was really not prepared to believe that they could set the river on fire. Yet I found that such was, scientifically, the fact. It was one of their most curious and at the same time useful appliances of a philosophical discovery. They separated water into two gases, and then, with their ingenious chemical skill, converted it into an economical fuel. Their coal mines had long been exhausted, as had any other of nature's resources for producing artificial heat. The dense population made it impracticable to cultivate forest for fuel. Its rapid increase demanded of science the discovery of a fuel that could be consumed without loss to them, both in the matter consumed and in the expense of procuring it. Nothing seemed to answer their purpose so admirably as water. Water, when decomposed, becomes gas. Convert the gas into heat, and it becomes water again. A very great heat produces only a small quantity of water, hence the extreme utility of water as a heat-producing agent. The heating factories were all detached buildings and generally, if at all practicable, situated near a river or other body of water. Every precaution against accident was stringently observed. There were several processes for decomposing the water explained to me, but the one preferred and almost universally used by the people of Mizora was electricity. The gases formed at the opposite poles of the electrical current were received in large glass reservoirs, especially constructed for them. In preparing the heat that gave such a delightful temperature to the dwellings and public buildings of their vast cities, glass was always the material used in the construction of vessels and pipes. Glass pipes conveyed the separate gases of hydrogen and oxygen into an apartment especially prepared for the purpose, and united them upon ignited carbon. The heat produced was intense, beyond description, and in the hands of less experienced and capable chemists would have proved destructive to life and property. The hardest rock would melt in its embrace, yet in the hands of these wonderful students of nature it was under perfect control and had been converted into one of the most healthful and agreeable agents of comfort and usefulness known. It was regulated with the same ease and convenience in which we increase or diminish the flame of a gas jet. It was conducted by means of glass pipes to every dwelling in the city. One factory supplied sufficient heat for over 500,000 inhabitants. I thought I was not so far behind Mizora in a knowledge of heating with hot air, yet when I saw the practical application of their method, I could see no resemblance to that in use in my own world. In winter, every house in Mizora has an atmosphere throughout as balmy as the breath of the young summer. Country houses and farm dwellings were all supplied with the same kind of heat. In point of economy, it could not be surpassed. A city residence containing 20 rooms of liberal size and an immense conservatory was heated entire, at a cost of 400 centimes a year, $1 per annum for fuel. There was neither smoke, nor soot, nor dust. Instead of entering a room through a register, as I had always seen heated air supplied, it came through numerous small apertures in the walls of a room quite close to the floor, thus rendering its supply imperceptible, and making a draught of cold air impossible. The extreme cheapness of artificial heat made a conservatory a necessary luxury of every dwelling. The same pipes that supplied the dwelling rooms with warmth supplied the hothouse also, but it was conveyed to the plants by a very different process. They used electricity in their hothouses to perfect their fruit, but in what way I could not comprehend. Neither could I understand their method of supplying plants and fruits with carbonic acid gas. They manufactured it and turned it into their hothouses during sleeping hours. No one was permitted to enter until the carbon had been absorbed. They had an instrument resembling a thermometer which gave the exact condition of the atmosphere. They were used in every house as well as in the conservatories. The people of Mizora were constantly experimenting with those two chemical agents, electricity and carbonic acid gas, in their conservatories. They confidently believed that with their service they could yet produce fruit from their hothouses that would equal in all respects the season-grown article. They produced very fine hothouse fruit. It was more luscious than any artificially ripened fruit that I had ever tasted in my own country, yet it by no means compared with their season-grown fruit. Their preserved fruit, I thought, was much more natural in flavor than their hothouse fruit. Many of their private greenhouses were on a grand scale and contained fruit as well as flowers. A family that could not have a hothouse for fresh vegetables, with a few fruit trees in it, would be poor indeed. Where a number of families had united in purchasing extensive grounds, very fine conservatories were erected. their expense being divided among the property holders and their luxuries enjoyed in common. So methodical were all the business plans of the Mizora people, and so strictly just were they in the observance of all business and social duties that no ill feeling or jealousy could arise from a combination of capital in private luxuries. Such combinations were formed and carried out upon strictly business principles. If the admirable economy with which every species of work was carried on in Mizora could be thoroughly comprehended, the universality of luxuries need not be wondered at. They were drilled in economy from a very early period. It was taught them as a virtue. Machinery with them had become the slave of invention. I lived long enough in Mizora to comprehend that the absence of pauperism, genteel and otherwise, was largely due to the ingenious application of machinery to all kinds of physical labor. When the cost of producing luxuries decreases, the value of the luxuries produced must decrease with it. The result is they are within reach of the narrowest incomes. A life surrounded by refinement must absorb some of it. I had a conversation with the preceptress upon this subject, and she said, "Some natures are so undecided in character that they become only what their surroundings make them. Others only partially absorb tastes and sentiments that form the influence about them. They maintain a decided individuality, yet they are most always noticeably marked with the general character of their surroundings. It is very, very seldom that a nature is fixed from infancy in one channel." I told her that I knew of people whose minds from infancy to mature age never left the grooves they were born in. They belonged to every nationality and had palaces built for them, and attendants with cultivated intelligences employed to wait upon them. "Are their minds of such vast importance to their nation? You have never before alluded to intellect so elevated as to command such royal homage." My friend spoke with awakened interest. "They are of no real importance at all," I answered, humiliated at having alluded to them. "Some of them have not sufficient intelligence to even feed themselves." "And what are they?" she inquired anxiously. "They are idiots, human vegetables." "And you build palaces for them, and hire servants to feed and tend them, while the bright, ambitious children of the poor among you struggle and suffer for mental advancement? How deplorably short-sighted are the wise ones of your world! Truly it were better in your country to be born an idiot than a poor genius." She sighed and looked grave. "What should we do with them?" I inquired. "What do you do with the useless weeds in your garden?" she asked significantly. "Do you carefully tend them, while drought and frost and lack of nourishment cause your choice plants to wither and die?" "We are far behind you," I answered humbly, "but barbarous as you think we are, no epithet could be too scathing, too comprehensive of all that was vicious and inhuman to apply it to a person who should dare to assail the expense of those institutions, or suggest that they be converted to the cultivation of intellect that could be improved." My friend looked thoughtful for a long time. Then she resumed her discourse at the point where I had so unfortunately interrupted it. "No people," she said, "can rise to universal culture as long as they depend upon hand labor to produce any of the necessities of life. The absence of a demand for hand labor gives rise to an increasing demand for brain labor, and the natural and inevitable result is an increased mental activity. The discovery of a fuel that is furnished at so small a cost, and with really no labor but what machinery performs, marks one grand era in our mental progress." In mentioning the numerous uses made of glass in Mizora, I must not forget to give some notice to their water supply in large cities. Owing to their cleanly advantages, the filtering and storing of rainwater in glass-lined cisterns supplied many family uses. but drinking water was brought to their large cities in a form that did not greatly differ from those I was already familiar with, excepting in cleanliness. Their reservoirs were dug in the ground and lined with glass, and a perfectly fitting cover placed on the top. They were constructed so that the water that passed through the glass feed pipes to the city should have a uniform temperature, that of ordinary spring water. The water in the covered reservoirs was always filtered and tested before passing into the distributing pipes. No citizen of Mizora ever hied to the country for pure water and fresh air. Science supplied both in a densely populated city. End of Chapter 9. Recording by J.A. Wells, Phoenix, Arizona. Part 1, Chapter 10 of Mizora, a Prophecy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.A. Wells, Phoenix, Arizona. Mizora, a Prophecy by Mary E. Bradley Lane. Chapter 10. When a question as to the existence of social distinctions would be asked the citizens of Mizora, the invariable answer would be, there were none, yet a long and intimate acquaintance with them assured me that there were. They had an aristocracy, but of so peculiar and amiable a kind that it deserves a special mention. It took a long time for me to comprehend the exact condition of their society in this respect, that there were really no dividing lines between the person who superintended the kitchen and the one who paid her for it. In a social point of view, I could plainly see, yet there were distinctions, and rather sharply defined ones, too. In order to explain more lucidly the peculiar social life of Mizora, I will ask you to remember some charity fair you have attended, perhaps participated in which had been gotten up and managed by women of the highest social rank. If in a country where titles and social positions were hereditary, it then represented the highest aristocracy of blood. Grand dames there departed from the routine of their daily lives and assumed the lowlier occupations of others. They stood behind counters, in booths, and sold fancy articles, or dispensed ices and lemonade, or waited upon customers at the refreshment tables, bringing in trays of eatables, gathering up and removing empty dishes, performing labor that, under the ordinary circumstances of life, they would not perform in their own homes, and for their own kindred. It was all done in the same conscious dignity and ease that characterized the statelier duties of their everyday life. One fact was apparent to all. They were gentlewomen still. The refinement of their home education and the charm of nourished beauty were, perhaps, more prominent in contrast with their assumed avocation. The charity fair, with its clerks and waiter girls and flower sellers called from the highest society, was a miniature picture of the actual everyday social life of Mizora. The one who ordered a dinner at their finest hotel had it served to her by one who occupied the same social standing. Yet there was a difference, but it was the difference of mind. The student in sociology discovers that in all grades of society, congenial natures gravitate to a center. A differentiation of the highest mental quality was the result of this law in Mizora, and its coordinate part, their aristocracy. The social organism did not need legislation to increase its benefits. It turned to science, and through science to nature. The laboratory of the chemist was the focus that drew the attention of all minds. Mizora might be called a great school of nature, whose pupils studied her every phase, and pried into her secrets with persistent activity, and obeyed her instructions as an imperative duty. They observed nature to be an economist, and practiced economy with scrupulous exactness. They had observed that in all grades of animal life, from the lowest form to the highest, wherever sociality had produced unity, a leader was evolved, a superiority that differed in power according to the grade of development. In earlier histories, the leaders were chosen for their prowess in arms. Great warriors became rulers, and soldiers were the aristocracy of the land. As civilization progressed and learning became more widely disseminated, the military retired before the more intellectual aristocracy of statesmanship. Politics was the grand entrance to social eminence. "But," my friend said, "we have arrived at a higher, nobler, grander age. The military and political supremacies lived out their usefulness and decayed. A new era arrived. The differentia of mind evolved in aristocracy. Science has long been recognized as the greatest benefactor of our race. Its investigators and teachers are our only acknowledged superiors and leaders. Generally, the grandest intellects and those which retain their creative power the longest are of exceptionally slow development. Precocity is short-lived and brilliant rather than strong. This I knew to be true of my own race. In Mizora, a mind that developed late lost none of the opportunities that belong exclusively to the young of my own and other countries of the outer world. Their free schools and colleges were always open, always free. For this reason, it was no unusual thing for a person of Mizora to begin life at the very lowest grade and rise to its supreme height. Whenever the desire awakened, there was a helping hand extended on every side. The distinction between the aristocracy and the lower class, or the great intellects and the less, was similar to the relative positions of teacher and pupil. I recognized in this social condition the great media of their marvelous approach to perfection. This aristocracy was never arrogant, never supercilious, never aggressive. It was what the philosophers of our world are: tolerant, humane, sublime. In all communities of civilized nations, marked musical talent will form social relations distinct from, but not superior to, other social relations. The leader of a musical club might also be the leader of another club devoted to exclusive literary pursuits, and both clubs possess equal social respect. Those who possess musical predilections seek musical associations. Those who are purely literary seek their congenials. This is true of all other mental endowments or tastes. That which predominates will seek its affinity, be it in science, literature, politics, music, painting, or sculpture. Social organizations naturally grow out of other business pursuits and vocations of all grades and kinds. The society of Mizora was divided only by such distinctions. The scientific mind had precedence of all others. In the social world, they found more congenial pleasure in one another, and they mingled more frequently among themselves. Other professions and vocations followed their example for the same reason. Yet neither was barred by social caste from seeking society where she would. If the artisan sought social intercourse with a philosopher, she was expected to have prepared herself by mental training to be congenial. When a citizen of Mizora became ambitious to rise, she did not have to struggle with every species of opposition and contend against rebuff and repulse. Correct language, refined tastes, dignified and graceful manners were the common acquirements of all. Mental culture of so high an order, I marveled that a lifetime should be long enough to acquire it in, was universal. Under such conditions, social barriers could not be impregnable. In a world divided by poverty and opulence in all their intermediate grades, wealth must inevitably be preeminent. It represents refined and luxurious environments, and, if mind be there, intellectual preeminence also. Where wealth alone governs society, it has its prerogatives. The wealth that affords the most luxurious entertainments must be the wealth that rules. Its privilege, its duty rather, is to ignore all applicants to fraternization that cannot return what it receives. Where mind is the sole aristocracy, it makes demands as rigid, though different, and mind was the aristocracy of Mizora. With them, education is never at an end. I spoke of having graduated at a renowned school for young ladies, and when I explained that to graduate meant to finish one's education, it elicited a peal of silvery mirth. "We never graduate," said Juana. "There is my mamma's mother, 2 centuries old, and still studying. I paid her a visit the other day, and she took me into her laboratory. She is a manufacturer of lenses and has been experimenting on microscopes. She has one now that possesses a truly wonderful power. The leaf of a pear tree that she had allowed to become moldy was under the lens, and she told me to look. A panorama of life and activity spread out before me in such magnitude that I could only compare it to the feeling one must possess who could be suspended in air and look down upon our world for a cycle of time. Immense plains were visible with animals grazing upon them, that fought with and devoured one another. They perished and sank away, and immense forests sprang up like magic. They were inhabited by insects and tiny creatures resembling birds. A sigh of air moved the leaf, and a tiny drop of water, scarcely discernible to the naked eye, rolled over the forests and plains, and before it passed to the other side of the leaf, a great lake covered the spot. My great-great-grandmother has an acute conductor of sound that she has invented, so exquisite a mechanism as to reveal the voice of the tiniest insect. She put it to my ear, and the bellowing of the animals in battle, the chirp of the insects, and the voices of the feathered mites could be clearly heard, but attenuated like the delicate note of 2 threads of spun glass clashed together. "And what good," I asked, "can all this knowledge do you? Your great-great-grandmother has condensed the learning of 2 centuries to evolve this one discovery. Is it not so?" "Yes," replied Juana, and her look and tone were both solemn. "You ask me what good it can do. Reflect. If the history of a single leaf is so vast and yet ephemeral, what may not be the history of a single world? What, after all, are we when such an infinitesimal space can contain such wonderful transactions in a second of time?" I shuddered at the thought she raised in my mind, but inherited beliefs are not easily dissipated, so I only sought to change the subject. "But what is the use of studying all the time? There should be some period in your lives when you should be permitted to rest from your labors. It is truly irksome to me to see everybody still eager to learn more. The artist of the kitchen was up to the National College yesterday attending a lecture on chemistry. The artist who arranges my rooms is up there today listening to one on air. I cannot understand why, having learned to make beds and cook to perfection, they should not be content with their knowledge and their work." "If you were one of us, you would know," said Juana. "It is a duty with us to constantly seek improvement. The culinary artist at the house where you are visiting is a very fine chemist. She has a predilection for analyzing the construction of food. She may someday discover how to produce vegetables from the elements. The artist who arranges your room is attending a lecture on air because her vocation calls for an accurate knowledge of it. She attends to the atmosphere in the whole house and sees that it is in perfect health-sustaining condition. Your hostess has a particular fondness for flowers and decorates all her rooms with them. All plants are not harmless occupants of living rooms. Some give forth exhalations that are really noxious. That artist has so accurate a knowledge of air that she can keep the atmosphere of your home in a condition of perfect purity. Yet she knows that her education is not finished. She is constantly studying and advancing. The time may come when she, too, will add a grand discovery to science. Had my ancestors thought as you do and rested on an inferior education, I should not represent the advanced stage of development that I do. As it is, when my mind reaches the age of my mother's, it will have a larger comprehensiveness than hers. She already discerns it. My children will have intellects of a finer grade than mine. This is our system of mind culture.
The intellect is of slower development than the body and takes longer to decay. The gradations of advancement from one intellectual basis to another in a social body require centuries to mark a distinct change in the earlier ages of civilization. But we have now arrived at a stage when advancement is clearly perceptible between one generation and the next. Juana's mother added, "Universal education is the great destroyer of castes. It is the conqueror of poverty and the foundation of patriotism. It purifies and strengthens national as well as individual character. In the earlier history of our race, there were social conditions that rendered many lives wretched, and that the law would not and, in the then state of civilization, could not reach. They were termed domestic miseries and disappeared only under the influence of our higher intellectual development. The nation that is wise will educate its children." Alas, alas, was my own silent thought. When will my country rise to so grand an idea? When will wealth open the doors of colleges, academies, and schools to make the fountain of knowledge as free as the God-given water we drink? And there rose a vision in my mind, one of those daydreams when fancy upon the wing takes some definite course, and I saw in my own land a temple of learning rise, grand in proportion, complete in detail, with a broad gateway, over whose wide-open, majestic portal was the significant inscription, "Enter who will, no warder stands watch at the gate." End of Chapter 10. Recording by J.A. Wells, Phoenix, Arizona.
Part 1, Chapter 11 of Mizora, A Prophecy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mizora, A Prophecy by Mary E. Bradley Lane. Part 1, Chapter 11. The government of Mizora not being of primary importance in the estimation of the people, I have not made more than a mere mention of it heretofore. In this respect I have conformed to the generally expressed taste of the Mizora people. In my own country the government and the aristocracy were identical. The government offices and emoluments were of the highest pinnacles of ambition. I mentioned the disparity of opinion between Mizora and all other countries I had known in regard to this. I could not understand why politics in Mizora should be of so small importance. The answer was, that among an educated and highly enlightened people, the government will take care of itself. Having been perfected by wise experience, the people allow it to glide along in the grooves that time has made for it. In form, the government of Mizora was a federal republic. The term of office in no department exceeded the limit of 5 years. The presidential term of office was for 5 years. They had one exceedingly peculiar law in regard to politics. No candidate could come before the public seeking office before having a certificate from the state college to which she belonged, stating her examination and qualifications to fill such an office. Just like examining for school teachers, I thought. And why not? Making laws for a state is of far more importance than making them for a few dozen scholars. I remember to have heard some of my American acquaintances say that in their country it was not always qualifications that get a candidate into office. Some of the ways were devious and not suitable for publicity. Offices were frequently filled by incompetent men. There had been congressmen and other offices of higher and more responsible duties filled by persons who could not correctly frame a sentence in their native language, who could not spell the simplest words as they were spelled in the dictionary unless it were an accident. To seek the office of president, or any other position under the general government, required an examination and certificate from the National College. The examinations were always public, and conducted in such a manner that imposture was impossible. Constituents could attend if they chose, and decided upon the qualifications of a favorite candidate. In all the public schools, politics, to a certain extent, formed part of the general education of every child. Beyond that, anyone having a predilection for politics could find in the state colleges and national colleges the most liberal advantages for acquiring a knowledge of political economy, political arithmetic, and the science of government. Political campaigns, if such a term could be applicable to the politics of Mizora, were of the mildest possible character. The papers published the names of the candidates and their examinations in full. The people read and decided upon their choice, and when the time came, voted. And that was the extent of the campaign enthusiasm. I must mention that the examinations on the science of government were not conducted as are ordinary examinations in any given study that consists of questions and answers. That was the preliminary part. There followed a thorough, practical test of their ability to discharge the duties of office with wisdom. No matter which side the sympathies or affections might be enlisted upon, the stern decree of justice was what the Mizorian abided by. From earliest infancy their minds were trained in that doctrine. In the discharge of all public duties especially, it seemed to be the paramount consideration. Certainly no government machinery ever could move with more ease, or give greater satisfaction to the people, than that of Mizora. They never appeared to be excited or uneasy about the result of the elections. I never heard an animated political argument such as I used to read about in America. I asked a politician one day what she thought of the probable success of the opposite party. She replied that it would not make any difference to the country as both candidates were perfectly competent to fill the office. "Do you never make disparaging statements about the opposing candidate?" was my inquiry. "How could we?" she asked in surprise, "when there are none to make? You might assume a few for the time being, just to make her lose votes. That would be a crime worthy of barbarians. Do you never have any party issues?" "No, there is never anything to make an issue of. We all work for the good of the people, and the whole people. There is no greed of glory or gain, no personal ambition to gratify. Were I to use any artifice to secure office or popularity, I should be instantly deprived of public esteem and notice. I do my duty conscientiously. That is the aim of public life. I work for the public good and my popularity comes as it is earned and deserved. I have no fear of being slighted or underrated. Every politician feels and acts the same way." "Have politicians ever bought votes with money, or offered bribes by promising positions that it would be in their official power to grant when elected?" "Never. There is not a citizen of Mizora who would not scorn an office obtained in such a way. The profession of politics, while not to be compared in importance with the sciences, is yet not devoid of dignity. It is not necessary to make new laws. They were perfected long ago, and what has been proven good we have no desire to change. We manage the government according to a conscientious interpretation of the law. We have repealed laws that were in force when our republic was young, and dropped them from the statute books. They were laws unworthy of our civilization. We have laws for the protection of property and to regulate public morals, and while our civilization is in a state of advancement that does not require them, yet we think it wisdom to let them remain. The people know that we have such laws and live up to them without surveillance. They would abide by the principles of justice set forth in them just as scrupulously if we should repeal them." "You spoke of bribes. In remote ages, when our country was emerging from a state of semi-barbarism, such things were in common practice. Political chicanery was a name given to various underhand and dishonest maneuvers to gain office and public power. It was frequently the case that the most responsible positions in the government would be occupied by the basest characters, who used their power only for fraud to enrich themselves and their friends by robbing the people. They deceived the masses by preaching purity. They were never punished. If they were accused and brought to trial, the wealth they had stolen from the government purchased their acquittal, and then they posed as martyrs. The form of government was then, as now, a federal republic, but the people had very little to do with it. They were merely the tools of unscrupulous politicians. In those days a sensitively honest person would not accept office, because the name politician was a synonym for flexible principles. It was derogatory to one's character to seek office." "Was dishonesty more prominent in one party than another?" I asked, thinking how very Americanish this history sounded. "We, who look back upon the conditions of those times and view it with dispassionate judgment, can perceive corruption in both political parties. The real welfare of the country was the last thing considered by a professional politician. There was always something that was to benefit the people brought forward as a party issue, and used as a means of working up the enthusiasm or fears of the people, and usually dropped after the election. The candidate for election in those days might be guilty of heinous crimes, yet the party covered them all, and over that covering the partisan newspapers spread every virtue in the calendar. A stranger to the country and its customs, reading one of their partisan newspapers during a political campaign, might conclude that the party it advocated was composed of only the virtues of the country, and the leader an epitome of the supremest excellence. Reading in the same paper a description of the opposing party, the stranger might think it composed of only the degraded and disreputable portion of the nation, and its leader the scum of all its depravity. If curiosity should induce a perusal of some partisan paper of the other party, the same thing could be read in its columns, with a change of names. It would be the opposite party that was getting represented in the most despicable character, and their leader was the only one who possessed enough honesty and talent to keep the country from going to wreck. The other party leader was the one who was guilty of all the crimes in the calendar. A vast number of people were ignorant enough to cling blindly to one party and to believe every word published by its partisan papers. Their superstitious party faith was what the unscrupulous politicians handled dexterously for their own selfish ends. It was not until education became universal, and a higher culture was forced upon the majority, the working classes, that politics began to purify itself, and put on the dignity of real virtue, and receive the respect that belongs to genuine justice. The people became disgusted with defamatory political literature, and the honorable members of both parties abjured it altogether. In such a government as this, two great parties could not exist, where one was altogether bad and the other altogether good. It became apparent to the people that there was good in both parties, and they began to elect it irrespective of party prejudice. Politicians began to work for their country instead of themselves and their party, and politics took the noble position that the rights of humanity designed it for. I have been giving you quite a history of our ancient politics. Our present condition is far different. As the people became enlightened to a higher degree, the government became more compact. It might now be compared to a large family. There are 100 states in the Union. There was a time when every state made its own laws for its own domestic government. One code of laws is now enforced in every state. In going from one state to another, citizens now suffer no inconvenience from a confusion of laws. Every state owes allegiance to the general government. No state or number of states could set up an independent government without obtaining the consent and legal dissolution from the general government. But such a thing will never be thought of. We have prospered as a great united nation. Our union has been our strength, our prosperity. I visited with Wauna a number of the state's capitals. In architecture the Mizora people display an excellent taste. Their public buildings might all be called works of art. Their government buildings, especially, were on a scale of magnificent splendor. The hollow square seemed to be a favorite form. One very beautiful capitol building was of crystal glass, with facing and cornices of marble onyx. It looked more like a gigantic gem than anything I could compare it to, especially when lighted up by great globes of white fire suspended from every ceiling. Upon my entrance into Mizora, I was led into the belief that I had arrived at a female seminary, because the dining and sleeping accommodations for the stateswomen were all in the Capitol building. I observed that the state capitals were similarly accommodated. In Mizora the home is the heart of all joy, and wherever a Mizora woman goes, she endeavors to surround herself with its comforts and pleasures. That was the reason that the splendid Capitol building had its home-like appointments, was a nation of women exclusively, at least as far as I had as yet been able to discover. Another reason for the homes of all officials of the government being within the public buildings was because all the personal expenses, excepting clothing, were paid by the government. The salaries of government positions were not large, compared with those of the sciences, but as their social and political dues were paid out of the public treasury, the salaries might be considered as net profit. The custom had originated many centuries in the past. In those early days, when a penurious character became an incumbent of public office, the social obligations belonging to it were often but niggardly requited. Sometimes business embarrassments and real necessity demanded economy. So at last the government assumed all expenses contingent upon every office, from the highest to the lowest. By this means the occupant of a government office was freed from every care but those of state. The number and style of all social entertainments that were obligatory of the occupant of a public office were regulated by law. As the people of Mizora believed in enjoyment, the entertainments provided by the government as the necessary social dues of its officers were not few, nor scantily furnished. End of Part 1, Chapter 11. Part 1, Chapter 12 of Mizora, a Prophecy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mizora, a Prophecy, by Mary E. Bradley Lane. Part 1, Chapter 12. The artificial light in Mizora puzzled me longest to understand. When I first noticed it, it appeared to me to have no apparent source. At the touch of a delicate hand, it blazed forth like a star in the center of the ceiling. It diffused a soft and pleasing brilliancy that lent a charm to everything it revealed. It was a dreamy daylight, and was produced by electricity. In large halls, like a theater or opera house, the light fell in a soft and penetrating radiance from the center of the dome. Its source was not visible to either audience or actresses, and in consequence occasioned no discomfort to the eyes. The light that illuminated the stage was similarly arranged. The footlights were not visible. They were in the rear of the stage. The light came upward like the rays of the setting sun, revealing the setting of the stage with vivid distinctness. I can best describe the effect of this singular arrangement by calling attention to the appearance of the sun when declining behind a small elevation. How sharply every object is outlined before it! How soft and delicate is the light in which everything is bathed! Every cloud that floats has all of its fleecy loveliness limned with radiant clearness. I was very desirous to know how this singular effect was produced, and at my request was taken to the stage. An opening in the back part of it was covered with pink-colored glass. Powerful electric lights from below the stage were reflected through the glass upon it. The glass was highly refractive and so perfectly translucent, I at first thought there was none there, and when I stood upon its edge, and looked down into a fiery gulf below, I instinctively thought of the lost people, who are said to wander amid torturing yet unconsumable flames. But happily the ones I gazed upon were harmless ones. The street lights of Mizora were at a considerable elevation from the ground. They were in, or over, the center of the street, and of such diffuse brilliancy as to render the city almost as light as day. They were in the form of immense globes of soft white fire, and during the 6 months that answered to the Mizora night, were kept constantly burning. It was during this period that the aurora borealis shone with such marvelous brilliancy. Generally, its display was heralded by an arc of delicate green tinted light that spanned the heavens. The green tint deepened into emerald, assuming a delicate rose hue as it faded upward into rays that diverged from the top until the whole resembled a gigantic crown. Every ray became a panorama of gorgeous colors, resembling tiny sparks, moving hither and thither with inconceivable swiftness. Sometimes a veil of mist of delicate green hue depended from the base of the crown, and swayed gently back and forth. As soon as the swaying motion commenced, the most gorgeous colors were revealed. Myriads of sparks, no larger than snowflakes, swarmed across the delicate green curtain in every conceivable color and shade, but always of that vapory, vivid softness that is indescribable. The dancing colors resembled gems encased in a film of mist. One display that I witnessed I shall attempt to describe. The arc of delicate green appeared first, and shot upward diverging rays of all the warm, rich hues of red. They formed a vast crown, outlined with a delicate halo of fire. A veil of misty green fluttered down from its base, and instantly tiny crowns, composed of every brilliant color, with a tracery of fire defining every separate one, began to chase one another back and forth with bewildering rapidity. As the veil swayed to and fro, it seemed to shake the crowns into skeins of fire, each thread strung with countless minute globes of every conceivable color and hue. Those fiery threads, aerial as thistledown, wove themselves in and out in a tangled mass of gorgeous beauty. Suddenly the beads of color fell in a shower of gems, topaz and emerald, ruby and sapphire, amethyst and pearly crystals of dew. I looked upward, where the rays of variegated colors were sweeping the zenith, and high above the first crown was a second more vivid still. Myriads of rainbows, the colors broad and intense, fluttered from its base, the whole outlined by a halo of fire. It rolled together in a huge scroll, and in an instant fell apart a shower of flakes, minute as snow, but of all the gorgeous dazzling hues of earth and sky combined. They disappeared in the mystery of space to instantly form into a fluttering waving banner of delicate green mist, and vanish, only to repeat itself. The display of the aurora borealis was always an exhibition of astonishing rapidity of motion of intense colors. The most glorious sunset, where the vapory billows of the sky have caught the bloom of the dying autumn, cannot rival it. All the precious gems of earth appeared to have dissolved into mist, to join in a wild and aerial dance. The people of Mizora attributed it entirely to electricity. Although the sun never rose or set in Mizora, yet for 6 months in a year that country had the heart of a voluptuous summer. It beat with a strong, warm pulse of life through all nature. The orchards bud and bloomed, and mellowed into perfect fruition their luscious globes. The fields laughed in the warm, rich light, and smiled on the harvest. I could feel my own blood bound as with a new lease of life at the first breath of spring. The winters of Mizora had clouds and rain and sleet and snow, and sometimes, especially near the circular sea, the fury of an Arctic snowstorm. But so well prepared were they that it became an amusement. Looking into the chaos of snowflakes, driven hither and thither by fierce winds, the pedestrians in the street presented no painful contrast to the luxury of your own room, with its balmy breath and cheerful flowers. You saw none but what were thoroughly clad, and you knew that they were hurrying to homes that were bright and attractive, if not as elegant as yours, where loving welcomes were sure to greet them and happiness would sit with them at the feast, for the heart that is pure has always a kingly guest for its company. A wonderful discovery that the people of Mizora had made was the power to annihilate space as an impediment to conversation. They claimed that the atmosphere had regular currents of electricity that were accurately known to them. They talked to them by means of simply constructed instruments, and the voice would be as audible and as easily recognized at 3,000 miles distant as at only 3 feet. Stations were built similar to our telegraph offices, but on high elevations. I understood that they could not be used upon the surface. Every private and public house, however, had communication with the general office, and could converse with friends at a distance whenever desirable. Public speakers made constant use of it, but in connection with another extraordinary apparatus which I regret my inability to perfectly describe. I saw it first from the dress circle of the theatre. It occupied the whole rear of the stage, and from where I sat looked like a solid wall of polished metal. But it had a wonderful function, for immediately in front of it, moving, speaking and gesturing, was the figure of a popular public lecturer, so lifelike in appearance that I could scarcely be convinced that it was only a reflection. Yet such it was, and the original was addressing an audience in person more than 1,000 miles distant. It was no common thing for a lecturer to address a dozen or more audiences at the same time, scattered over an area of thousands of miles, and everyone listening to and observing what appeared to be the real speaker. In fact, public speakers in Mizora never traveled on pure professional business. It was not necessary. They prepared a room in their own dwelling with the needful apparatus, and at the time specified deliver a lecture in 20 different cities. I was so interested in this remarkable invention that I made vigorous mental exertions to comprehend it sufficiently to explain its mechanism and philosophical principles intelligently, but I can only say that it was one of the wonders those people produced with electricity. The mechanism was simple, but the science of its construction and workings I could not comprehend. The grasp of my mind was not broad enough. The instrument that transmitted the voice was entirely separate. I must not neglect to mention that all kinds of public entertainments, such as operas, concerts and dramas, could be and were repeated to audiences at a distance from where the real transaction was taking place. I attended a number of operas that were only the reflex of others that were being presented to audiences far distant. These repetitions were always marvels of accuracy, of vividness. Small reflecting apparatus were to be found in every dwelling and business house. It is hardly necessary to state that letter writing was an unknown accomplishment at Mizora. The person who desired to converse with another, no matter how far distant, placed herself in communication with her 2 instruments and signaled. Her friend appeared upon the polished metal surface like the figure in a mirror, and spoke to her audibly, and looked at her with all the naturalness of reality. I have frequently witnessed such interviews between Wauna and her mother, when we were visiting distant cities. It was certainly a more satisfactory way of communicating than by letter. The small apparatus used by private families and business houses were not like those used in public halls and theatres. In the former, the reflection was exactly similar to the image of a mirror. In the latter, the figure was projected upon the stage. It required more complicated machinery to produce, and was not practicable for small families or business houses. I now learned that on my arrival in Mizora I had been taken to one of the largest apparatus and put in communication with it. I was informed by Wauna that I had been exhibited to every college and school in the country by reflex representation. She said that she and her mother had seen me distinctly and heard my voice. The latter had been so uncongenial in accent and tone that she had hesitated about becoming my instructor on that account. It was my evident appreciation of my deficiencies as compared to them that had enlisted her sympathy. Now in my own country my voice had attracted attention by its smoothness and modulation, and I was greatly surprised to hear Wauna speak of its unmusical tone as really annoying. But then in Mizora there are no voices but what are sweet enough to charm the birds. In the journeys that Wauna and I took during the college vacation we were constantly meeting strangers, but they never appeared the least surprised at my dark hair and eyes, which were such a contrast to all the other hair and eyes to be met with in Mizora, that I greatly wondered at it until I learned of the power of the reflector. I requested permission to examine one of the large ones used in a theatre, and it was granted to me. Wauna accompanied me and signalled to a friend of hers. As if by magic, a form appeared and moved across the stage. It bowed to me, and smiled and motioned with its hand, to all appearances a material body. I asked Wauna to approach it, which she did, and passed her hand through it. There was nothing that resisted her touch, yet I plainly saw the figure, and recognized it as the perfect representation of a friend of Wauna's, an actress residing in a distant city. When I ascended the stage, the figure vanished, and I understood that it could be visible only at a certain distance from the reflector. In traveling great distances, or even short ones, where great speed was desired, the Mizorians used airships, but only for the transportation of passengers and the very lightest of freight. Heavy articles could not be as conveniently carried by them as by railroads. Their railroads were constructed and conducted on a system so perfect that accidents were never known. Every engineer had an electric signal attached to the engine that could signal a train 3 miles distant. Their motive power for nearly all engines was compressed air. Electricity, which was recognized by Mizora scientists as a force of great intensity, was rarely used as a propelling power on railroads. Its use was attended by possible danger, but compressed air was not. Electricity produced the heat that supplied the airships and railroads with that very necessary comfort. In case there should be an accident, as a collision, or thrown from the track, heat could not be a source of danger when furnished by electricity. But I never heard of a railroad accident during the whole 15 years that I spent in Mizora. Airships, however, were not exempt from danger, although the precautions against it were ingenious and carefully observed. The Mizora people could tell the approach of a storm, and the exact time it would arrive. They had signal stations established for the purpose all over the country. But though they were skilled mechanics, and far in advance of my own world, and the limits of my comprehension in their scientific discoveries and appliances, they had not yet discovered the means of subduing the elements, or driving unharmed through their fury. When nature became convulsed with passion, they guarded themselves against it, but did not endeavor to thwart it. Their airships were covered and furnished with luxurious seats. The whole upper part of the car was composed of very thin glass. They traveled with, to me, astonishing rapidity. Towns and cities flew away beneath us like birds upon the wing. I grew frightened and apprehensive, but Wauna chatted away with her friends with the most charming unconcern. I was looking down when I perceived, by the increasing size of objects below, that we were descending. The conductor entered almost immediately and announced that we were going down to escape an approaching storm. A signal had been received, and the ship was at once lowered. I felt intensely relieved to step again on solid earth, and hoped I might escape another trial of the upper regions. But after waiting until the storm was over, we again entered the ship. I was ashamed to refuse when everyone else showed no fear. In waiting for the storm to pass, we were delayed so long that our journey could have been performed almost as speedily by rail. I wondered why they had not invented some means by which they could drive through a tempest in perfect safety. As usual, I addressed my inquiries to Wauna. She answered: "So frail a thing as an airship must necessarily be when compared with the strength of a storm, it is like a leaf in the wind. We have not yet discovered, and we have but little expectation of discovering, any means by which we can defy the storms that rage in the upper deeps. The electricity that we use for heat is also a source of danger during a storm. Our policy is to evade a peril we cannot control or destroy. Hence, when we receive a signal that a storm is approaching we get out of its way. Our railroad carriages, having no danger to fear from them, ride right through the storm." The people of Mizora, I perceived, possessed a remarkable acuteness of vision. They could see the odor emanating from flowers and fruit. They described it to me as resembling attenuated mist. They also named other colors in the solar spectrum than those known to me. When I first heard them speak of them, I thought it a freak of the imagination, but I afterward noticed artists and persons who had special taste for colors always detected them with greater readiness. The presence of these new colors were apparent to all with whom I spoke upon the subject. When I mentioned my own inability to discern them, Wauna said that it was owing to my inferior mental development. "A child," she said, "if you will observe, is first attracted by red, the most glaring color known. The untutored mind will invariably select the gaudiest colors for personal adornment. It is the gentle, refined taste of civilization that chooses the softened hues and colors." "But you as a nation are remarkable for rich warm colors in your houses and often in your dress," I said. "But they are never glaring," she replied. "If you will notice, the most intense colors are always so arranged as to present a halo, instead of sharply defined brilliancy. If a gorgeous color is worn as a dress, it will be covered with filmy lace. You have spoken of the splendor of the aurora borealis. It is nature's most gorgeous robe, and intense as the primal colors are, they are never glaring. They glow in a film of vapor. We have made them our study. Art, with us, has never attempted to supersede nature." The sense of smell was also exceedingly sensitive with the Mizora people. They detected odors so refined that I was not aware of them. I have often seen a chemist take a bottle of perfumery and name its ingredients from the sense of smell only. No one appeared surprised at the bluntness of my senses. When I spoke of this, Wauna tried to explain it. "We are a more delicately organized race of beings than you are. Our intellects, and even sense that we possess, is of a higher and finer development. We have some senses that you do not possess, and are unable to comprehend their exquisite delicacy. One of them I shall endeavor to explain to you by describing it as impression. We possess it in a highly refined state, both mentally and physically. Our sensitiveness to changes of temperature, I have noticed, is more marked than yours. It is acute with all of my people. For this reason, although we are free from disease, our bodies could not sustain, as readily as yours could, a sudden and severe shock to their normal temperature, such as a marked change in the atmosphere would occasion. We are, therefore, extremely careful to be always appropriately clothed. That is a physical impression. It is possessed by you also, but more obtusely. Our sensitiveness to mental pleasure and pain you would pronounce morbid on account of its intensity. The happiness we enjoy in the society of those who are congenial, or near and dear to us through family ties, is inconceivable to you. The touch of my mother's hand carries a thrill of rapture with it. We feel intuitively the happiness or disappointment of those we are with. Our own hopes impress us with their fulfillment or frustration, before we know what will actually occur. This feeling is entirely mental, but it is evidence of a highly refined mentality. We could not be happy unless surrounded, as we are, by cultivated and elegant pleasures. They are real necessities to us. Our appreciation of music, I notice, has a more exquisite delicacy than yours. You desire music, but it is the simpler operas that delight you most. Those fine and delicate harmonies that we so intensely enjoy, you appear incapable of appreciating. I have previously spoken of their elegance in dress, and their fondness for luxury and magnificence. On occasions of great ceremony, their dresses were furnished with very long trains. The only prominent difference that I saw in their state dresses and the rare and costly ones I had seen in my own and other countries was in the waist. As the women of Mizora admired a large waist, their dresses were generally loose and flowing. Ingenuity, however, had fashioned them into graceful and becoming outlines. On occasions of great state and publicity, comfortably fitting girdles confined the dress at the waist. I attended the inaugural of a professor of natural history in the National College. The one who had succeeded to this honor was widely celebrated for her erudition. It was known that the ceremony would be a grand affair, and thousands attended it. I there witnessed another of these marvelous achievements in science that were constantly surprising me in Mizora. The inauguration took place in a large hall, the largest I had ever seen. It would accommodate 200,000 people, and was filled to repletion. I was seated far back in the audience, and being a little short-sighted anyway, I expected to be disappointed both in seeing and hearing the ceremonies. What was my astonishment, then, when they began, to discover that I could see distinctly every object upon the stage, and hear with perfect accuracy every word that was uttered. Upon expressing myself to Wauna as being greatly pleased with that my eyesight and hearing had improved so wonderfully and unexpectedly, she laughed merrily, and asked me if I had noticed a curious looking band of polished steel that curved outward from the proscenium, and encircled its entire front. I had noticed it, but supposed it to be connected with some different arrangement they might have made concerning the footlights. Wauna informed me that I owed my improved hearing to that. "But my eyesight?" I asked. "How do you account for its unusual penetrativeness?" "Have you ever noticed some seasons of the year display a noticeably marked transparency of the atmosphere that revealed objects at great distances with unusual clearness? Well, we possess a knowledge of air that enables us to qualify it with that peculiar magnifying condition. On occasions like this we make use of it. This hall was built after the discovery, and was specially prepared for its use. It is seldom employed in smaller halls." Just then a little flutter of interest upon the stage attracted my attention, and I saw the candidate for the professorship entering, accompanied by the faculty of the National College. She wore a sea green velvet robe with a voluminous train. The bottom of the dress was adorned with a wreath or band of water lilies, embroidered in seed pearls. A white lace overdress of filmiest texture fell over the velvet, almost touching the wreath of lilies, and looked as though it was made of sea foam. A girdle of large pink pearls confined the robe at the waist. Natural flowers were on her bosom and in her hair. The stage was superbly decorated with flowers and shells. A large chair, constructed of beautiful shells and cushioned with green velvet, rested upon a dais of coral. It was the chair of honor. Behind it was a curtain of sea moss. I afterward learned that the moss was attached to a film of glass too delicate to detect without handling. In the midst of these charming surroundings stood the applicant for honor. Her deep blue eyes glowed with the joy of triumph. On the delicate cheek and lip burned the carmine hue of perfect health. The golden hair even seemed to have caught a brighter luster in its coiled masses. The uplifted hand and arm no marble goddess could have matched, for this had the color and charm of life. As she stood revealed by the strong light that fell around her, every feature ennobled with the glory of intellect, she appeared to me a creature of unearthly loveliness, as something divine. I spoke to Wauna of the rare beauty and elegance of her dress. "She looks like a fabled naiad just risen from the deep," was my criticism on her. "Her dress," answered Wauna, "is intended to be emblematical of nature. The sea green robe, the water lilies of pearls, the foamy lace are all from nature's cradle of life." "How poetical!" I exclaimed. But then Mizora is full of that charming skill that blends into perfect harmony the beautiful and useful in life. End of Part 1, Chapter 12.
Part 1, Chapter 13 of Mizora, a Prophecy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.J. Green. Mizora, a Prophecy by Mary E. Bradley Lane. Part 1, Chapter 13. On my return to college after the close of vacation, I devoted myself exclusively to history. It began with their first president, and from the evidence of history itself, I knew that the nation was enjoying a high state of culture when its history began. No record of a more primitive race was to be found in all of the library, assiduously as I searched for it. I read with absorbing interest their progress toward perfect enlightenment, their laborious searchings into science that had resulted in such marvelous achievements. But earnestly as I sought for it, and anxiously as I longed for it, I found and heard no mention of a race of men. From the most intimate intercourse with the people of Mizora, I could discover no attempt at concealment in anything, yet the inquiry would crowd itself upon me, where are the men? And as constantly would I be forced to the conclusion that Mizora was either a land of mystery beyond the scope of the wildest and weirdest fancy, or else they were utterly oblivious of such a race. And the last conclusion was the most improbable of all. Man, in my country, was a necessity of government, law, and protection. His importance, as I viewed it from inherited ideas, was incalculable. It could not be possible that he had no existence in a country so eminently adapted to his desires and ability. The expression domestic misery that the preceptress made use of one day in conversation with me haunted my imagination with a persistent suspicion of mystery. It had a familiar sound to me. It intimated knowledge of a world I knew so well, where ill nature, malice, spite, envy, deceit, falsehood, and dishonesty made life a continual anxiety. Locks, bolts, and bars shut out the thief who coveted your jewels, but no bolts nor bars, however ingeniously constructed or strongly made, could keep out the thief who coveted your character. One little word from a pretended friend might consummate the sorrow of your whole life, and be witnessed by the perpetrator without a pang, nay, even with exultation. There were other miseries I thought of that were common in my country. There were those we love, some who are woven into our lives and affections by the kinship of blood, who grow up weak and vacillating, and are won away, sometimes through vice, to estrangement. Our hearts ache not the less painfully that they have ceased to be worthy of a throb, or that they have been weak enough to become estranged, to benefit some selfish alien. There were other sorrows in that world that I had come from, that brought anguish alike to the innocent and the guilty. It was the sorrow of premature death. Diseases of all kinds made lives wretched, or tore them asunder with death. How many hearts have ached with cankering pain to see those who are vitally dear wasting away slowly but surely with unrelievable suffering, and to know that life but prolongs their misery, and death relieves it only with inconsolable grief for the living. Who has looked into a pair of youthful eyes, so lovely that imagination could not invent for them another charm, and saw the misty film of death gather over them, while your heart ached with regret as bitter as it was unavailing? The soft snows of winter have fallen, a veil of purity, over the new-made graves of innocence and youth, and its wild winds have been the saddest requiem. The dews of summer have wept with your tears, and its zephyrs have sighed over the moldering loveliness of youth. I had known no skill in my world that could snatch from death its unlawful prey of youth. But here in this land, so eminently blessed, no one regarded death as a dreaded invader of their household. "We cannot die until we get old," said Juana naively. And looking upon their bounding animal spirits, their strong, supple frames, and the rich red blood of perfect health mantling their cheeks with its unsurpassable bloom, one would think that disease must have a strong grasp indeed that could destroy them. But these were not all the sorrows that my own country knew. Crimes with which we had no personal connection shocked us with their horrible details. They crept, like noxious vapors, into the moral atmosphere of the pure and good, tainting the weak and annoying the strong. There were other sorrows in my country that were more deplorable still. It was the fate of those who sought to relieve the sufferings of the many by an enforced government reform. Misguided, imprudent, and fanatical they might be, but their aim at least was noble. The wrongs and sufferings of the helpless and oppressed had goaded them into action for their relief, but alas! The pale and haggard faces of thousands of those patriot souls faded and wasted in torturing slowness in dungeons of rayless gloom, or their emaciated and rheumatic frames toiled in speechless agony amid the horrors of Siberia's mines. In this land, they would have been recognized as aspiring natures, spreading their wings for a nobler flight, seeking a higher and grander life. The smile of beauty would have urged them on. Hands innumerable would have given them a cordial and encouraging grasp. But in the land they had sought to benefit and failed, they suffered in silence and darkness, and died, forgotten or cursed. My heart and my brain ached with memory, and the thought again occurred. Could the preceptress ever have known such a race of people? I looked at her fair, calm brow, where not a wrinkle marred the serene expression of intellect, although I had been told that more than 100 years had touched with increasing wisdom its broad surface. The smile that dwelt in her eyes, like the mystic sprite in the fountain, had not a suspicion of sadness in them. A nature so lofty as hers, where every feeling had a generous and noble existence and aim, could not have known, without anguish, the race of people I knew so well. Their sorrows would have tinged her life with a continual sadness. The words of Juana had awakened a new thought. I knew that their mental life was far above mine, and that in all the relations of life, both business and social, they exhibited a refinement never attained by my people. I had supposed these qualities to be an endowment of nature, and not a development sought and labored for by themselves. But my conversation with Juana had given me a different impression, and the thought of a future for my own country took possession of me. Could it ever emerge from its horrors and rise through gradual but earnest endeavor to such perfection? Could a higher civilization crowd its sufferings out of existence and, in time, memory? I had never thought of my country having a claim upon me other than what I owed to my relatives and society. But in Mizora, where the very atmosphere seemed to feed one's brain with grander and nobler ideas of life and humanity, my nature had drank the inspiration of good deeds and impulses, and had given the desire to work for something beside myself and my own kindred. I resolved that if I should ever again behold my native country, I would seek the good of all its people along with that of my nearest and dearest kin. But how to do it was a matter I could not arrange. I felt reluctant to ask either Juana or her mother. The guileless frankness of Juana's nature was an impassable barrier to the confidence of crimes and wretchedness. One glance of horror from her dark, sweet eyes would have chilled me into painful silence and sorrowful regret. The mystery that had ever surrounded these lovely and noble blonde women had driven me into an unnatural reserve in regard to my own people and country. I had always perceived the utter absence of my allusion to the masculine gender, and conceiving that it must be occasioned by some more than ordinary circumstances, I refrained from intruding my curiosity. That the singular absence of men was connected with nothing criminal or ignoble on their part, I felt certain, but that it was associated with something weird and mysterious, I had now become convinced. My efforts to discover their whereabouts had been earnest and untiring. I had visited a number of their large cities, and had enjoyed the hospitality of many private homes. I had examined every nook and corner of private and public buildings, for in Mizora nothing ever has locks, and in no place had I ever discovered a trace or suggestion of man. Women and girls were everywhere. Their fair faces and golden heads greeted me in every town and city. Sometimes a pair of unusually dark blue eyes, like the color of a velvet-leaved pansy, looked out from an exquisitely tinted face, framed in flossy golden hair, startling me with its unnatural loveliness, and then I would wonder anew, why is such a paradise for man so entirely devoid of him? I even endeavored to discover from the conversation of young girls some allusion to the male sex, but listen as attentively and discreetly as I could, not one allusion did I hear made to the mysteriously absent beings. I was astonished that young girls, with cheeks like the downy bloom of a ripe peach, should chatter and laugh merrily over every conversational topic but that of the lords of society. The older and the wiser among women might acquire a depreciating idea of their worth, but innocent and inexperienced girlhood was apt to surround that name with a halo of romance and fancied nobility that the reality did not always possess. What, then, was my amazement to find them indifferent and wholly neglectful of that, to me, very important class of beings. Conjecture at last exhausted itself, and curiosity became indifferent. Mizora, as a nation or an individual representative, was incapable of dishonor. Whatever their secret, I should make no further effort to discover it. Their hospitality had been generous and unreserved. Their influence upon my character, morally, had been an incalculable benefit. I had enjoyed being among them. The rhythm of happiness that swept like a strain of sweet music through all their daily life touched a chord in my own nature that responded. And when I contrasted the prosperity of Mizora, a prosperity that reached every citizen in its vast territory, with the varied phases of life that are found in my own land, it urged me to inquire if there could be hope for such happiness within its borders. To the preceptress, whose sympathies I knew were broad as the lap of nature, I at last went with my desire and perplexities. A sketch of my country's condition was the inevitable prelude. I gave it without once alluding to the presence of man. She listened quietly and attentively. Her own land lay like a charming picture before her. I spoke of its peaceful happiness, its perfected refinement, its universal wealth, and paramount to all its other blessings, its complete ignorance of social ills. With them, love did not confine itself to families, but encircled the nation in one embrace. How dismal, in contrast, was the land that had given me birth. But one eminent distinction exists among us as a people, I added in conclusion. We are not all of one race. I paused and looked at the preceptress. She appeared lost in reverie. Her expression was one of solicitude, and approached nearer to actual pain than anything I had ever noticed upon it before. She looked up and caught my eye regarding her. Then she quietly asked, "Are there men in your country?" End of Part 1, Chapter 13. Part 2, Chapter 1 of Mizora, a Prophecy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.J. Green. Mizora, a Prophecy by Mary E. Bradley Lane. Part 2, Chapter 1. I answered in the affirmative, and further added that I had a husband and a son. The effect of a confession so simple and so natural wounded and amazed me. The preceptress started back with a look of loathing and abhorrence, but it was almost instantly succeeded by one of compassion. "You have much to learn," she said gently, "and I desire not to judge you harshly. You are the product of a people far back in the darkness of civilization. We are a people who have passed beyond the boundary of what was once called natural law. But more correctly, we have become mistresses of nature's peculiar processes. We influence or control them at will. But before giving you any further explanation, I will show you the gallery containing the portraits of our very ancient ancestors." She then conducted me into a remote part of the National College, and sliding back a panel containing a magnificent painting, she disclosed a long gallery, the existence of which I had never suspected, although I knew their custom of using ornamented sliding panels instead of doors. Into this I followed her with wonder and increasing surprise. Paintings on canvas, old and dim with age, paintings on porcelain and a peculiar transparent material, of which I had previously spoken, hung so thick upon the wall that you could not have placed a hand between them. They were all portraits of men. Some were represented in the ancient or medieval costumes of my own ancestry, and some in garbs resembling our modern styles. Some had noble countenances, and some bore on their painted visages the unmistakable stamp of passion and vice. It is not complimentary to myself to confess it, but I began to feel an odd kind of companionship in this assembly of good and evil-looking men, such as I had not felt since entering this land of preeminently noble and lovely women. As I gazed upon them, arrayed in the armor of some stern warrior, or the velvet doublet of some gay cavalier, the dark eyes of a debonair knight looked down upon me with the familiar fellowship. There was pride of birth, and the passion of conquest in every line of his haughty, sensuous face. I seemed to breathe the same moral atmosphere that had surrounded me in the outer world. They had lived among noble and ignoble deeds, I felt sure. They had been swayed by conflicting desires. They had known temptation and resistance and reluctant compliance. They had experienced the treachery and ingratitude of humanity and had dealt in it themselves. They had known joy as I had known it, and their sorrow had been as my sorrows. They had loved as I had loved, and sinned as I had sinned, and suffered as I had suffered. I wept for the first time since my entrance into Mizora the bitter tears of actual experience, and endeavored to convey to the preceptress some idea of the painful emotion that possessed me. "I have noticed," she said, "in your own person and the descriptions you have given of your native country, a close resemblance to the people and history of our nation in ages far remote. These portraits are very old. The majority of them were painted many thousands of years ago. It is only by our perfect knowledge of color that we are enabled to preserve them. Some have been copied by expert artists upon a material manufactured for us by that purpose. It is a transparent adamant that possesses no refractive power. Consequently, the picture has all the advantage of a painting on canvas, with the addition of perpetuity. They can never fade nor decay." "I am astonished at the existence of this gallery," I exclaimed. "I have observed a preference for sliding panels instead of doors, and that they were often decorated with paintings of rare excellence, but I had never suspected the existence of this gallery behind one of them." "Any student," said the preceptress, "who desires to become conversant with our earliest history can use this gallery. It is not a secret, for nothing in Mizora is concealed, but we do not parade its existence, nor urge upon students an investigation of its history. They are so far removed from the moral imbecility that dwarfed the nature of these people that no lesson can be learned from their lives, and their study can be so much more profitably spent in scientific research and study." "You have not, then, reached the limits of scientific knowledge?" I wonderingly inquired, for to me they had already overstepped its imaginary pale. "When we do, we shall be able to create intellect at will. We govern to a certain extent the development of physical life, but the formation of the brain, its intellectual force, or capacity, I should say, is beyond our immediate skill. Genius is yet the product of long cultivation." I had observed that dark hair and eyes were as indiscriminately mingled in these portraits as I had been accustomed to find them in the living people of my own and other countries. I drew the preceptress's attention to it. "We believe that the highest excellence of moral and mental character is alone attainable by a fair race. The elements of evil belong to the dark race." "And were the people of this country once of mixed complexions?" "As you see in the portraits, yes," was the reply. "And what became of the dark complexions?" "We eliminated them." I was too astonished to speak, and stood gazing upon the handsome face of a young man in a plumed hat and lace-frilled doublet. The dark eyes had a haughty look, like a man proud of his lineage and his sex. "Let us leave this place," said the preceptress presently. "It always has a depressing effect upon me." "In what way?" I asked. "By the degradation of the human race that they force me to recall." I followed her out to a seat on one of the small porticos. In candidly expressing herself about the dark complexions, my companion had no intention or thought of wounding my feelings. So rigidly do they adhere to the truth in Mizora that it is of all other things preeminent, and is never supposed to give offense. The preceptress but gave expression to the belief inculcated by centuries of the teachings and practices of her ancestors. I was not offended. It was her conviction. Besides, I had the consolation of secretly disagreeing with her. I am still of the opinion that their admirable system of government, social and political, and their encouragement and provision for universal culture of so high an order, had more to do with the formation of superlative character than the elimination of the dark complexion. The preceptress remained silent a long time, apparently absorbed in the beauty of the landscape that stretched before us. The falling waters of a fountain was all the sound we heard. The hour was auspicious. I was so eager to develop a revelation of the mystery about these people that I became nervous over my companion's protracted silence. I felt a delicacy in pressing inquiries concerning information that I thought ought to be voluntarily given. Inquisitiveness was regarded as a gross rudeness by them, and I could frame no question that I did not fear would sound impertinent. But at last patience gave way, and at the risk of increasing her commiseration for my barbarous mental condition, I asked, "Are you conversant with the history of the times occupied by the originals of the portraits we have just seen?" "I am," she replied. "And would you object to giving me a condensed recital of it?" "Not if it can do you any good." "What has become of their descendants, of those portraits?" "They became extinct thousands of years ago." She became silent again, lost in reverie. The agitation of my mind was no longer endurable. It was too near the acme of curiosity to longer delay. I threw reserve aside, and not without fear and trembling, faltered out, "Where are the men of this country? Where do they stay?" "There are none," was the startling reply. "The race became extinct 3,000 years ago." End part 2, chapter 1.